Okay, so hello, my name is Morgan Whitley, and welcome to my presentation on jaw diversity in theropod dinosaurs. Now, we're very lucky today as I get to talk about theropods for the better part of half an hour, and theropods are awesome. So, to start off with, let's just talk about where they came from. So, 252 million years ago in the Triassic, dinosaurs diverged from dinosauromorph ancestors and split off into three main groups. So these are, you've got the ornithischians, the sauropods, and of course, the subject of today's presentation, the theropods. Now, due to significant climate changes that happened during the Jurassic, theropods went on to diversify and occupy a wide range of different lifestyles, ranging from insectivores, herbivores, omnivores, carnivores, piscivores, so fish-eating dinosaurs, and then, of course, the macrocarnivores, the big apex predators that are very famous within this group, such as Tyrannosaurus rex. Not only did they occupy a huge range of different lifestyles, they also occupied a ginormous range of sizes. So ranging from being less than a meter long with species called Microraptor, being all the way to 15 meters long with Spinosaurus, being some of the largest land predators to ever walk the earth. And this diagram is roughly to scale, as scale as I could get it, just to try and showcase just the sheer difference in size. You can barely see Microraptor here next to Spinosaurus. Then, of course, unfortunately, at the end of the Cretaceous period, 66 million years ago, dinosaurs go out with a bang as an asteroid hits the planet, causing the extinction of all non-avian species. Now, I say non-avian species as dinosaurs are still around today in their descendants with the birds, which have gone on to occupy their own wide variety of different lifestyles today. And the reason that I mention this in this presentation is because theropods are the direct lineage that goes on to become the birds. And when you see with species like Archaeopteryx within the family, you can really start to see that bird-like resemblance coming in. So, therefore, because theropod dinosaurs have this connection to birds, they occupied all these different sizes and lifestyles, it has been hypothesized that they had a wide range of different jaw forms suitable for the lifestyles that they occupy, as it's long been shown that different forms have optimized for different functional traits. So if you have a shorter and a broader jaw, that jaw is going to be able to bite down with much harder bite forces than a longer, thinner one, but this longer, thinner jaw is able to close at much faster speeds. So you can already start to see where this would kind of be useful for certain lifestyles. So a quicker jaw would be useful for catching fast-moving prey, so fish or insects, whereas a shorter, broader jaw with these tougher bite forces would be useful for helping to bring down tougher armored prey, or in terms of herbivores trying to feed on tough vegetation at the time, like conifers. So therefore, because of this, there's already been a variety of research that has been done looking at jaw form in theropods. However, none have used the methodology that's been used in my project, which is called theoretical morphometrics, which basically takes the shape of existing dinosaur jaws and uses this to create potential possible or theoretical shapes that could have been achieved by the group, and then projecting the actual shapes to determine how much of the possible forms have been occupied and allow for speculation as to why those forms might not have been occupied. So therefore, the aims of my project were as followed: to try and determine if functional traits were optimized between different families and diets, as well as looking at the variation between different diets and families in terms of form, as well as also the difference between different sizes as you're getting bigger, as well as you move through the different periods that these dinosaurs were living through. I also wanted to demonstrate which forms were the most optimal for particular traits, so strength, speed, and as well as a trade-off between the two, as well as if the forms were optimal for the lifestyle that that theropod was occupying, as well as demonstrating how size was impacting the development of jaw form, as well as showing where theropod evolution was progressing towards, and perhaps where jaw form might have ended up going should the group have continued to exist. So therefore, before the start of my investigation, I came up with some hypotheses. So these were some statements that I believed the results would show me based on previous investigations and my own sort of knowledge of theropods. So my first kind of hypothesis was I believed that the piscivores, the insectivores, and the smaller theropod species would have jaw forms more optimal for high-speed forms due to the fact that they're feeding on smaller, faster-moving prey and therefore would need these faster jaws to be successful. Then, on the contrary, I believed that the herbivores and the larger theropods and the macrocarnivores would have jaw forms more suitable for strength due to, in the terms of herbivores, feeding on tough vegetation and the macrocarnivores trying to bring down these large armored herbivores of the time. However, I anticipated that the macrocarnivores would have much stronger forms compared to the herbivores. So then I also anticipated that the small carnivores as well as the omnivores would have jaw forms that were suitable for a trade-off, so a mix of both strength and speed, as they're feeding on a variety of different food sources, and therefore they'd want to have the best of both to ensure that they could be successful in this wide range of food sources. I also anticipated that Megalosauroidea would have the largest variety of form within that group because they contain a variety of different species occupying different lifestyles. So you've got macrocarnivores within the group, such as Megalosaurus, you've got the piscivores, like the Spinosaurus, and then you've got these smaller omnivorous and carnivorous species like Scurryminus. Therefore, because of this diversity of lifestyles as well as sizes within this group, I anticipated there'd be a variety of form as well. And then finally, I anticipated that jaw form would be progressing towards forms most optimal for strength due to the large amount of macrocarnivores that were present within the group. So now I've mentioned that the methods for this project was theoretical morphometrics. I'm just going to go into a bit like what was the steps behind this process. So first of all, I needed to find the species I was going to include for my jaws. And so I wanted to make sure I was showcasing all of the different families within this group, as well as making sure I represented all the different lifestyles and different sizes that are present within theropods. So this led to me collecting 372 species of theropods, with 55 basal sauropodomorphs and ornithischians acting as an outgroup, so something I could compare theropods to see how much it differentiated from other groups. So once I got my species, it was actually time to get information on their jaws, and this was collected from scientific papers to ensure that it was as up-to-date, the information, and as accurate as it possibly could be. Now, for the information about the jaws came from a variety of different sources in scientific papers, ranging from photographs of of specimens that have been found, or a line drawing of a specimen, as you can see there, or reconstructions of a species. So a reconstruction is where they've only found parts of the species, and they'll use related species to help fill in the gaps. So as you can see to the far right, you can see the white area on this jaw is the known information, and the grayed out areas has been filled in with related species, as well as also photographs as well of museum reconstructions as well that were in scientific papers. So now I've got all my images of my jaws, I've got all my species I'm working with. Now it's time to actually start creating the morphospace. So what I needed to do is I needed to get the overall shape of the jaw. Now we're looking at just the mandible in this investigation, and we're just looking at jaw form. So basically I traced around the jaw with a software called ImageJ and just drew around it, ignoring the top jaw as well as any dentition to get these outlines for all of my species. Now I'm going to go on a brief tangent just to mention that unfortunately, because we were ignoring dentition, we lost some teeth for some amazing species. And I just want to pay note to Incisivosaurus, the buck-toothed dinosaur, and it really hurt to cut his teeth out. and I felt really bad. So we're just going to have a moment's silence for Ensiphosaurus. Okay, we've had enough for him. So now it's time to actually start using those jaws. So to create the morphospace, it was done in a software called MATLAB. And to do this, it needed to understand the shapes of the jaws. So the way it did this was through a process called elliptical foray analysis, which basically is fancy speak for it compared the outline of the jaw to an ellipsis or an oval of roughly the same size. And as you can see, there's all these red points along the surface of the jaw. Now, these are what we call landmarks. This was a point along the surface of the jaw where the analysis would stop and compare to the surface of the oval to see how much it differentiated. Now, to ensure that I was accurately importing the shape into MATLAB, I had it use 1,300 of these along the surface of the jaw. And then you could use a function in MATLAB called the draw function, which would let MATLAB try and recreate the species jaw to see, and you could compare between the two to see if it correctly understood it. So then it was on to the creation of the morphospace. Once I had those forms, I would just type in the piece of code and it would generate these theoretical shapes in a plot like this. So as you can see, and it goes from one extreme to the other. Now, these theoretical shapes, I told it to generate 1,000 of these to try and showcase the full range of forms that would be possible across theropods. And then onto this plot, I can then actually project the actual jaw images that I use for species to see where they would be occupying within this space. So you can see how much of these possible forms have been occupied by currently known theropods. So that's how we looked at form. So now for function, what we did is we created heat maps, which basically would go on top of the morphospace and represent areas of high values for either strength or speed. Now, to look at strength, I used a proxy called von Mises stress, which was basically calculated by finite element analysis and was demonstrating the stress that the jaw experienced during action, so during biting. And basically, it worked under the assumption that we want low stress. If you're biting hard, you don't want to be experiencing lots of stress because otherwise the jaw will break during trying to bite. So for this, we assumed that anywhere that was indicating low von Mises stress was indicating high strength areas. Then for speed, we use rotational efficiency, which is basically the rotation of the jaw joint around the jaw hinge, and basically was the assumption that high rotations will allow for much faster closure. Now, to ensure that these were accurate, these would be calculated 1,000 times for each jaw, and then an average would be calculated for each jaw to ensure that any sort of anomalous results wouldn't have any sort of significant impact. And then to look at a trade-off, basically I created a Pareto optimality front, which creates another heat map that can go directly onto the morphospace, representing areas more suitable for a trade-off, and was under the assumption that low stress and high rotation is optimal. Now, when we look at the heat maps, we'll see that there are darker colors and there are lighter colors. The darker colors are indicating higher values, lighter colors indicate lower values, and any grayed out areas are deemed impossible space, so forms that are either too weak to function or closing too fast or too slowly. So then the final stage was to create a phylomorphospace. So this is a phylogeny, and basically it's a diagram showing the relationships between all of the species within my investigation to show how they were related to each other. Then using this, I could combine it with my morphospace to demonstrate which individual species were causing a certain jaw form on the morphospace, and could also show how they were related to each other, the jaw shapes, to see which direction evolution was progressing towards. So, now that we've got an understanding of the methods, now it's on to the results. So here are the four most extreme forms that were created during my construction of the morphospace. And as you can see, the major variations are to length. You've got some longer ones on this side, on the far right, and then close to me, they're much shorter but much thicker. You also have some variations to curvature as well. So you've got ones that curve upwards or downwards, or in the terms of more thicker jaws, rather than in terms of curvature, it changes the direction it increases in thickness towards. So this top one here, it increases in thickness towards the surangula, or where the jaw joint would be, or on the bottom, it thickens towards the dentary, or the part of the jaw which would bear the teeth. So now here is the morphospace. So you can now see clearly this is where our most extreme forms are. So you can see that moving over towards the right, you get longer and thinner. Moving to the left towards me, you are getting shorter and broader. Curving upwards is coincidentally moving upwards, and curving downwards is downwards. Or on the thicker side, you thicken towards the surangula, moving upwards, or towards the dentary, moving downwards. So now, here is our heat map for stress. So as I mentioned, darker colours are indicating higher values, lighter colours indicate lower values. So as you can see, for the most part, this map is quite light in colour, which is good because this is stress. So we want low stress to indicate good strength. So on the whole, this is showing the theropod form is actually quite well optimized for high strength. However, there are some trends that you can see. As you can see, as you increase the thickness of the jaw and decrease its length, it is decreasing the VMS value. So it's increasing in strength. Whereas if you increase length or decrease thickness, it will get weaker. It will be a weaker jaw. There isn't much variation in terms of curvature or the direction that you thicken the jaw towards as well. So then, this is the rotational efficiency, so for speed. And as you can see, this heat map is quite dark blue in colour. And you can, so once again, showing that theropod form is actually also quite well optimized for high speed as well. But as you can see, there is a trend, but in this case, as you decrease thickness but increase length, the jaw forms become much faster compared to increasing thickness and decreasing length will have much slower forms. And once again, there is little variation when it comes to curvature or in terms of the direction of thickness. So now for the Pareto, representing the kind of trade-off between those two traits. And as you can see, in this case, there really isn't much trend in terms of changes to thickness or to length. As you move horizontally, it doesn't really change too much. It remains quite constant. However, as you curve upwards it tends to get more dark blue, indicating that curving the jaws upwards is actually more efficient for a trade-off compared to curving downwards. But it is quite dark blue on the whole again, indicating that overall theropod form is quite well optimized for a trade-off. So now we start projecting the species onto this morphospace, and we've grouped them by what family they belong to first. And as you can see, it's kind of a mess in the center. There is a lot of different families all clustered towards the center of the morphospace around a form of average length and average thickness with not much variation in terms of curvature. However, there are some exceptions. The major exception belongs to this group here, which is the oviraptors, which are branching off in a significant direction towards forms which are much broader and shorter, but also have they increase in thickness towards the dentary rather than the surangula. You also have a few species for Allosauridia, Paraves, and Ornithomimosauria, which branch out towards these thinner, longer forms, but they don't vary too much in curvature as well, and it's only a handful of species. So when we overlay the VMS heat map, you can see that the oviraptors are branching off towards these forms more suitable for high strength, and whereas when we look at the Allosauridia and Paraves and Ornithomimosauria, they are branching off towards these forms which are more optimized for speed, and then the rest of the species are kind of clumped together, well, the rest of the families are kind of clumped together in the center of the morphospace, which is the area most optimal for a trade-off between the two traits. So now we've grouped the species by diet, And as you can see, it's a bit clearer, but there is a lot of kind of chaos once again happening towards the center of the morphospace, where most of the diets are represented. But once again, we have some major kind of branching off groups. Omnivores are the particular biggest group. As you can see, they branch off towards these forms which are thicker and broader and shorter, with herbivores, but omnivores also branch off towards these longer, thinner forms as well, along with the carnivores. You can also see that the macrocarnivores do kind of break away from the major cluster towards these slightly more shorter and thicker forms, and they do thicken slightly towards the Sarangula, but not much. It's only a couple of species. So when we overlay the VMS heat map, you can see the herbivores and the this side of the omnivores are branching towards those areas more suitable for high strength. And the macrocarnivores are also sort of investigating that area of high strength. When you look at the RE heat map, you can see that omnivores are also going into these higher speed areas as well as with the carnivores. And the rest of the families are once again clumped together within these areas for a trade-off. So now we're going to look at how size impacted the results. So I wanted to make sure I accurately captured the different ways size could be playing a role on jaw form and function. So I used 3 different measurements for size. The first one being body length. I used the length of the mandible, the length of the lower jaw, as well as body mass. And as you can see, well, before I say that, it must be noted as well, due to the fact that some species I was unable to find published size data for, I had to exclude them from the construction of these morphospaces. It doesn't change the results, and it keeps like a similar consistency to the previous morphospaces, but it must be noted as it does change the way the heat maps look on the next few slides. So it's just a heads up. But as you can see, they're all showing something quite similar. As you increase in the size metric, you get reduced diversity in form. So as you can see with body mass, the largest one being over 12 meters, you're constrained towards this area of the morphospace. When we look at mandible length, so this is any mandibles over 125 centimeters, this is the most restricted, the most reduced diversity. It's constrained to this area here. And then when we look at size, so anything over 1,000 kilograms, this was the least constrained, but it's constrained to this area, the morphospace. And as you can see, it's always occupying this similar sort of area. So a form that is slightly slightly reduced length and more broad, as well as thickening slightly towards the Sarangula. But these areas are still occupied by the majority of the other lower size metrics that we see as you go down. I think the only exception is when you get to like the smaller ends of the scale, so like the less than a meter, less than 5 centimeters, and less than a kilogram. So as you can see, when we overlay the VMS heat map, you can see that as you're increasing size, you're going towards forms that are more suitable for high strength, but less optimal for speed, and the least optimal for a trade-off. So now, this is when I group them by what time period the species belong to. So, as you can see, as we move through time now, so going from the Triassic all the way to Cretaceous, you increase the diversity of jaw form. So in the Triassic, you're restricted to the center of the morphospace towards those forms of average length and average thickness, not much variation in curvature. Then you move into the Jurassic, and they begin to branch out significantly towards these longer, thinner forms, but still occupying that those center forms as well that we can see. And then moving into Cretaceous, the Cretaceous further begins to develop on those longer, thinner forms, but also significantly starts to branch off towards these shorter but broader, thicker forms. So when we overlay the VMS heat map, you can see the Cretaceous is exploring those areas most optimal for strength, but also it's exploring those areas most optimal for speed, but the Jurassic is just solely looking at those areas. And then as we move on to the Preto, you can see that the Triassic, or the center of the morphospace, are coming from areas most suitable for a trade-off between strength and speed. So now here is the final morphospace. Now it looks very confusing. I was unsure how to show it, but the main thing that you need to take away is this was just showing where certain species were responsible, well, which species were responsible for those major kind of branching away from the major cluster in the center. So the oviraptors that were branching off significantly towards those broader, thicker forms, it was the species Gobiraptor, Coryphoraptor, and Osoka. As for the Allosaurid, it was Schizanosaurus. The Pares, it was a Sinosauropteryx. And Ornithomimosauria, it was Gallimimus. So those were those species plotting in those high speed areas, those longer, thinner forms. And then for the macrocarnivores achieving those higher strength forms, those belong to, of course, Tyrannosaurus rex, Extrixonatosaurus, Thanosteris, Gorgosaurus, and Scorpiovenator as well. And then finally, as I mentioned, I included reconstruction data in my results. So I wanted to see if this was having any sort of impact on the results that I was getting. So I redid the morphospaces, excluding the reconstructed data. So this first one at the top is just the morphospace we've been seeing throughout the investigation. So we're very familiar with this one. But the second one towards the far right, that one was any species that had over 50% of the mandible unknown. They were excluded from the construction of the morphospace. So it's just species with under 50% reconstructed. And then this one here is, it had to have the complete mandible known. The complete mandible had been found and recorded and was demonstrated. It was used for the creation of this morphospace. And as you can see, there isn't much change between these three morphospaces. They all show similar sorts of trends. The only major difference that I've been able to find is between the less than 50 and the 0%, we lose this species of oviraptor. I believe it's Coryphoraptor, but that's the only difference I've been able to see between these morphospaces. So, now we've looked at all of my results. What is this trying to show us? Well, as you could see, we were seeing that both the theropod form was quite well optimized naturally for both strength and speed. Like it did, so therefore, even when a certain lifestyle will require it to prioritize for either one of those traits, it would still naturally be good at the other trait it wasn't prioritizing. This meant that theropod species were always optimal for a trade-off for the most part, meaning that optimality through time for a trade-off changed very little, despite the fact that as we move through time, you can see that they are progressing towards forms that are more optimal for both strength and speed. Now, you can see as well the reasoning behind them progressing through time, and you see this increase in towards forms that are more suitable for strength and speed through time, is because during the Triassic, most of the theropods are small and they're just carnivorous. So I think they're no bigger than like 3 meters long, and all being carnivorous mean they're all occupying similar lifestyles, and therefore there's not diversity in lifestyles. It's not going to be reflected in their jaws. So, but then when you move into the Jurassic with those significant climate changes, you then start to get them diversifying, occupying all the different lifestyles that we have seen in this project. So they begin to occupy herbivory, omnivory, piscivory, macrocarnivory, and therefore we start to see that increase in diversity in jaw form. But then the reason we see this secondary increase again in the Cretaceous is because of more complex predator-prey interactions, as well as competition between species as well. A particular instance that we can take an example for is during in the Jurassic, sauropod dinosaurs, so these long-necked dinosaurs, just relied on their size to deter predators. Being big was enough and nothing would go against them. But then in the Cretaceous, we actually get species of sauropods called the Titanosaurs, which actually started to develop bony plates along their back to protect them because there was species that were preying on them. Size was no longer enough. So these species were stuff like Carcharodontosaurus. But if there's now got to deal with bony plates, it's going to require higher bite forces to be able to bite through that skin. Therefore, it's going to lead to more optimal forms for strength being realized. So then, as we're saying, although we're seeing this huge diversity in form as we move from the Triassic to the Jurassic and then to the Cretaceous, most of the morphospace was actually unoccupied. About 50% of the possible space was unoccupied. Now, this could be because these would have been forms that would have been achieved in future evolution of theropods had the group persisted. But I believe the usage of reconstructions could provide a bit of an answer as to why we don't see these areas occupied. As I've mentioned, when you reconstruct a species, use the information from a related species to supply the missing information. So an example is Ceratopsuchops, or the hell heron. And as you can see, they didn't know much about its mandible, so they used the information from Spinosaurus to fill in the gaps. So therefore, its mandible is quite similar in shape to Spinosaurus's, and therefore plots closely on the morphospace. However, this might not be the actual case in life, and perhaps Ceratopsuchops had a drastically different mandible shape to Spinosaurus and could have potentially occupied those unoccupied areas of the morphospace. So now on to the hypotheses. So for the most part, they were proven correct, with piscivores and insectivores being in areas that were having forms suitable for speed, and carnivores and omnivores having forms suitable for a trade-off, and the herbivores and the macrocarnivores did have forms optimal for high strength. However, there was a particularly interesting fact, as I was assuming that the herbivores would have forms that were weaker compared to the macrocarnivores, but in actuality, not only were they occupying areas of similar strengths, in some cases they were occupying areas of far greater strengths than the macrocarnivores. And this was attributed to one main group, the oviraptors. So now, this I believe could be saying a couple of different things. So first of all, it could be saying something about oviraptors' diet. So oviraptors' diet has long been up to debate, and there's been a lot of papers published on this topic. And the results of this investigation could indicate that the fact that they have these jaws that are suitable for high strengths indicates they're feeding on tough substrates, so perhaps tough vegetation, bark, seeds, nuts, or shellfish that require these high jaw strengths to be able to crack open. Or perhaps, because if they are herbivorous, perhaps because they are freed from the constraint of having to optimize speed. Because although macrocarnivores will be wanting to optimize for strength for feeding on these large herbivorous armored herbivores, they will also have to have some optimization for speed because their prey can move. Whereas herbivores don't have that issue. Plants won't be really moving anywhere of their own free will, therefore they can largely not have to optimize for speed and could just focus solely on optimizing for strength, having forms suitable for high strengths. However, another potential thing these results could indicate is perhaps that jaw form is not as optimal, well, it's not as important in lifestyle occupation in theropods as other structures, such as tooth morphology or jaw musculature, which is supported by the fact that most of the theropod forms in my investigation were always naturally good for just strength and speed. Therefore, would need very little variation to form in order to be able to successfully occupy its lifestyle. Another interesting part of my results is, as I said, carnivores were shown to mostly occupy areas suitable for a trade-off. There were some species that were occupying areas of high speed, and this belonged to groups in the Pares, particularly Sinosauropteryx. Now, this is because these species have actually been found with bird bones preserved in their stomach. So therefore, they're actually doing something quite specialized. And because birds are capable of flight, they're capable of being fast-moving, you're going to want to be able to close your jaws quicker to be able to be more successful in catching them. But also, because birds are capable of flight, to be able to fly, they are quite hollow, they're quite lightweight, and therefore they break easily. Therefore, strength is not as important for their jaws. So hence, the reason we're seeing these carnivores have forms more suitable speed is because there is a bit more specialization going on with this group. So then, my other hypothesis was about Megalosauroidea occupying the widest diversity of jaw forms within my morphospace. And as you can tell by the fact that I have only just mentioned them at this point in the presentation, they really didn't do that. They were always in that major sort of mess of species towards the center of the morphospace. And when you lay out their forms like this, you can see that for the most part, they're quite similar in shape. As you can see at the top, we've got Spinosaurus, then Scurrymammoth underneath it, and Megalosaurus underneath that. And as you can see, the only real difference you can see is the dentary is slightly longer in Spinosaurus compared to the other two, but for the most part, these are roughly the same shape. Now, this could be lending support to the idea that perhaps theropods are optimizing other structures to be able to successfully occupy their lifestyles, so such as tooth morphology or jaw musculature, and is a byproduct of the fact that theropod jaw form is just so well optimized for both strength and speed naturally that it doesn't really have to do much variation to form to shift dramatically between these lifestyles. But on the contrary, oviraptors occupy a huge area of the morphospace. They occupy the majority of the space that is occupied by species. Now, this could be because, again, these are herbivorous taxa, and could be because they are freed from the constraint of speed and can optimize just solely on strength, or it could be due to the direction of evolution, because the Megalosauroidea are progressing from areas of high strength in terms of the macrocarnivorous Megalosauruses to high speed in terms of the Spinosauruses, whereas oviraptors are going from areas of a trade-off to high strength. Now, finally, we're going to talk about size. Now, as we can see, my results are showing as theropods got bigger, the diversity in their jaw form decreased. Now, at first I thought perhaps this could be a sampling bias, so perhaps there is currently more information or more known species of smaller theropods compared to larger ones, therefore making it seem there's limited diversity within the larger theropods. However, when I looked over my dataset as well as through scientific papers, it actually turns out there is a bias to sampling and recording larger theropod species, so meaning that if there was any sort of increase in diversity to be biased towards, it would be towards the larger theropods. So therefore, this is showing that these results are to be believed. Now, this could be because perhaps the size constraints can kick in. As theropods are getting bigger, they have to have a certain sort of body shape in order to be able to move and be successful at that size, whereas the smaller theropods don't have that disadvantage and therefore are free to optimize form in the ways more suitable for their lifestyle. However, it could also be due to the fact that larger theropods are all occupying a similar sort of lifestyle as well. So the large theropods, for the most part, are macrocarnivores, with the exception of a couple of piscivores in terms of like Spinosaurus. So therefore, whereas the smaller theropods are occupying the diversity of lifestyles that are present, but are seen across the entire group, with exceptions when you get down to the smaller species, macrocarnivory will no longer be occupied. So therefore, it could just be because there is more diversity of lifestyles in the smaller theropods compared to the large ones, there is an increase in diversity of form. So overall, to conclude, for the most part, the hypotheses in my investigation were proven correct, but the major difference was tending to be shown at herbivores having forms more optimal for strength than the macrocarnivores, and was attributed to Oviraptorsauria. Now, this could be showing that oviraptors are feeding on tough substrates such as seeds, nuts, bark, tough vegetation, or shellfish, or could be indicating perhaps that jaw form is not as important in a lifestyle occupation in theropods of other structures such as tooth morphology or jaw musculature. Therefore, future investigations could either look more closely at jaw form and oviraptors to try and determine if this is something indicating their diet, or comparing jaw form and tooth form, or jaw morphology and musculature to each other to see if there is any sort of change in diversity between these. So, thank you for watching, and any questions?